I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the topic of industrialization, the questions of man and machine, in our continuing survey of world civilizations. The Industrial Revolution begins in England in the late 1700s. Of course, England is an island, and that means that it's rather self-contained. There was relative peace in the cities, but they had enjoyed a spectacular sea trade that was now growing and would lead to the British. In fact, the claim is going to be made. The sun never sets on the British Empire. We're going to see England become the superpower. Now, technological innovations, for example, beginning to use coal instead of wood for burning things, and you can burn it a lot hotter and contain it, and it lasts a bit longer. The idea of using machines instead of manpower. These things are going to have a big change in industry and in beginning to manufacture products. The use of inorganic instead of organic materials. Again, this is going to have a big impact. That means that farms are going to they're not going to disappear. People will still need food, but we're going to gradually shift now, or maybe not so gradually shift, from an agricultural economy to a much more industrialized economy. So the Industrial Revolution begins in England, and we begin to see things like clothing manufacture. What's interesting is before the Industrial Revolution, in the early 1700s, people basically wore sort of one style of clothing. It was one style fits all. By the time we get to the 1800s, that has changed in a big way just in what people are wearing. You're beginning to have clothing styles. Now, we take that for granted today, but they did not take it for granted back then. Machinery begins. We're going to see in the 1800s the steam engine. Engineering is going to change the way people travel, change the way people dress themselves, change the way people manufacture items. That Industrial Revolution begins in England, but quickly it will move to the continental Europe. We're going to see France and Germany especially follow in the footsteps of England, also Belgium and to some degree Switzerland. It will gradually move toward the east, and we're going to see the Scandinavian countries and also Russia and Austria-Hungary, Italy. Notice that Spain and Portugal and the Ottoman Empire, they come at the very end of the 1800s, where they're going to be very slow to catch up. Now, with the Industrial Revolution is going with all this production, you're going to have a problem of pollution. I'm not even sure if they're calling it that yet, but they're going to be quickly recognizing the problem that the air within these cities where mass factories are contained becomes almost unbreathable. And in the 1800s, there's a picture that we have of these cities that become overcast. You never see the sun, and it's industry at its worst. You also have the issue of child labor laws, where initially there are none, and when they begin to be passed, laws such as stating that no children under 10 years old can work in the factories, which tells you that they were having children that young work in the factories. Here's a cartoon from that era. Notice the picture of big business, the factory owner who is exploiting child labor. Notice this one is directed in the United States, Philadelphia. Now, it's around this time in the mid-1800s, the Industrial Revolution is well underway, and we have Charles Darwin. He takes his 5-year voyage aboard the HMS Beagle as the ship's naturalist. Darwin had actually trained as a theology student. There had been a tragedy in his family that caused him to lose his faith, and instead he embarked. He had already had something of an interest in biology and especially bugs, but he obtains a posting aboard the Beagle, and after he has returned from his voyage, he writes his epic book, The Origin of the Species. He says there, the mystery of the beginning of all things. Now, because when he talks about the origin of the species, he's not necessarily talking about how humans come about. He doesn't really address this. And so notice he says the mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. That is, he doesn't know how it all started. Where did it? If all life began from a single-celled organism, and he is postulating that sort of evolving, but where did the single-cell organism come from? Where did life begin? And he says, well, I don't know. Likewise, where did the universe come from? He says, I don't know, which is the words of an agnostic, somebody who says, is there God? And he would say, I don't know. Now, Huxley takes Darwin's theory and is going to take it several steps further. Here's a quote from Huxley. He says, man is not a finished product incapable of further progress. He has a long history behind him, and it is a history not of a fall, but of an ascent. That is, man is getting better and better. And in the 1800s, both beginning with the Industrial Revolution and then with Darwin and others, there was a very optimistic outlook, both among philosophers and even among theologians, really, in many regards, that the human race was getting better and we're improving, and there'll come a time where we're going to do away with war and we'll be at peace and we'll bring in a glorious super age. Christians might have said a millennium, there was a spirit of optimism. Now, Carl Pearson, professor of applied mathematics at University College in London, takes Darwin's theory and applies it to society, so that he comes up with what we call social Darwinism, saying he's seeking to take the same sort of evolutionary thought and applies it to the human race, but specifically to people of different ethnicities, saying that's also evolution. That evolution has had, there's some nations, some peoples, some races, he would say, are getting better, and others are sort of holding them back. And so it's up to those more advanced races to evolve. He gives a speech at Newcastle in 1900, The National Life from the Standpoint of Science. He says in that speech, and we have a complete outline of it, you can look it up, history shows me one way, and one way only, in which a high state of civilization has been produced, namely the struggle of race with race and the survival of the physically and mentally fitter race. And so he's saying, look, there are some races that are more advanced than others, and that's a product of evolution as well. He goes on to say, if you bring the white man into contact with the black, you too often suspend the very process of natural selection on which the evolution of a higher type depends. You get superior and inferior races living on the same soil, and that coexistence is demoralizing for both. They naturally sink into the position of master and servant, if not admittedly or covertly into that of slave, owner, and slave. Now remember, he's speaking in the 1800s. Where this has been, up to his point very recently, a big issue. He goes on to say, this dependence of progress on the survival of the fitter race, terribly black as it may seem to some of you, gives the struggle for existence its redeeming features, that is, the fiery crucible out of which comes the finer metal. So we need, certain races need to enslave and subjugate and maybe even do away with other races so that the more advanced race can advance. He goes on to say later on in his speech, the path of progress is strewn with the wreck of nations. Traces are everywhere to be seen of the hecatombs of inferior races and of victims who found not the narrow way to the greater perfection. Yet these dead peoples are in very truth the stepping stones on which mankind has arisen to the higher intellectual and deeper emotional life of today. So what mankind needs to do, what those higher, more evolved races need to do, they need to go to war and they need to subjugate and conquer and maybe even destroy those inferior races. Now, Rudyard Kipling, a famed poet, writes a poem depicting some of that thinking, and it's entitled "The White Man's Burden." He says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go send your sons to exile to serve your captives' needs. To wait in heavenly harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." He goes on to say, "Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward, the blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard, the cry of hosts ye humor, slowly to the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, our loved Egyptian night?" Others, like Friedrich Nietzsche, remember he's the German philosopher who came out with that statement that God is dead and we have killed him, and of course eventually Nietzsche eventually went insane because he admitted he could not live with his own philosophy. But he envisions this. I'm going to mispronounce it. I'm sorry, I don't speak German. This Übermensch, these supermen. And a race of those that are evolving and getting better, and it is up to them to conquer and to put aside all inferior races. That mercy and kindness are inferior qualities. Those aren't good qualities. Those are bad qualities because they hold this race of supermen back. And so it's going to take somebody with the boldness and the courage to put aside mercy and kindness and bring the conflict that will escalate and cause to evolve this race of supermen. Now, these are the things that people were teaching back then. Teaching matters. Philosophy matters. And so he saw this necessity to involve a willingness to transcend weak moral systems, as he would put it, systems like Christianity, systems like kindness. We need to get past that, he would teach. And of course, his greatest pupil is going to be one who comes in the next century, and that will be Adolf Hitler. Now, Europe from 1871 to 1914, in fact, they oftentimes refer to the late 1800s as the gay 90s. They're using the word gay, not in a sense that we use it today. The actual meaning of the word has changed. Back then, it just meant happy, the happy 1890s. It was the highest level of literacy that the world in general had ever known. Highest level of technology, of productivity of labor, and things were being mass produced, which brought their prices down and put lots of people to work, but not necessarily for high wages. Highest level of public hygiene, where many of the problems that you would see in cities, where the rivers would become virtual cesspools. And this is beginning now to change a bit. The highest level of longevity, at least in Europe. Now, that's going to gradually make its way to other countries as the European colonies begin to advance medicine and things like that as well. It was also the rise of merit versus aristocracy. Remember, prior to this time in Europe, you'd had an aristocracy. If you were nobility, that meant you didn't work. And you didn't have to work because you owned the land and you had serfs on the land. They would do the work and you would just reap the rewards. But now we're going to begin to see those self-made men who build factories and men who plan and organize industry, and they're going to be now advanced into a higher level of culture, looked up to now. In fact, aristocracy is going to begin to go by the wayside. Europe, again, from 1871 to 1914, London had now become the financial capital of the world. We mentioned that phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And we mean by that the various colonies, whether Canada or India or Egypt and all over the world, there were British colonies. Paris was becoming the center of Western culture, where if you were cultured, if you were rich, you were from England, but if you were cultured, you also spoke French. And so the French language had become one of the major lingua franca, at least of educated people around the world. Germany was now passing England with regards to industry, and it was now becoming the industrial center of the world. You also begin to have the rise now of the middle class, those who were not the aristocracy. They're not necessarily those who had founded the factories, but those others, sometimes, for example, people that worked in banks and bookkeepers and things like that. And notice how they're dressed with white collars. And we use that phrase even today, where we talk about the blue collar worker versus the white collar worker. The white collar worker is the one who works in an office. And this begins to rise now in Europe at this time. The importance of having money versus land. Remember the aristocracy, they had land, but sometimes they had land and their finances were just going down, down, down. But now you have the rise of people who they may not have a title and they might not have these great amounts of land, European lands, but now they're making money. And they're able to live as though they are aristocracy. This is also a time of strict moral code. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's following the moral code, but it was there. In fact, we talk about the Victorian age in England and Victorian morals. Very high degree of morality. Again, look at the way the women are dressed. The dress is all the way down to their ankles, and it might be scandalous to actually show a little bit of ankle or to see a woman's leg, or even to refer to a leg instead of a limb or something like that. So this Victorian era morals now, we see this during this era. This is the rise of the temperance movement. Now, the movements had actually been there earlier, but now you actually begin to see laws passed outlawing the drinking of various alcoholic beverages. And because if we can only get rid of alcohol, then we can get rid of drunkenness, and we can call everybody to live a more socialized, more upright life. It's a rise of religion. Of course, we had the first and by now second Great Awakening, and they have had their impact, but also now it's not just religious in nature. In other words, I begin to see the churches very established, and it becomes part of culture now. It's not just religious, it's religious culture. The role of women during this period was basically to be the leader behind the husband of the family. Her role was in the home, and this was the proper role of women. That's the way it was depicted during this era. Notice this billboard says a guide to Cook's tours in France. And Cook comes up with what is known as the Grand Tour. Now, previously, it had been only the aristocracy that was able to travel. But now we have people that are making money, and they are able to act like aristocracy, as Thomas Cook makes a company that is able to take them as tourists and give them that aristocratic experience of going to places like Switzerland and Italy. Prior to this, people normally stayed, within just a few miles of where they were born and lived their whole lives there. But now we're beginning to see travel. This is the first guidebook ever written, and today you can see all sorts. You can go to various bookstores, go on Amazon, and see all sorts of guidebooks. But this was the beginning of that phenomena. Now, you also begin to see during this time a a rising trend in anti-Semitism. There had, for many hundreds of years, been historical limitations upon the Jews. They had been prohibited in many countries from owning land. They were relegated to money lending and banking, and the reason that happened in Europe especially is because the Christians were actually forbidden to charge interest. They could loan money, but you could get it back, but you could not charge interest. That was considered usury. The Jewish people were allowed to do that, and so they had advanced in this area of banking, and now it had become quite profitable, and people looked upon them with the result. There were various stereotypes, and notice the cartoon drawn in the 1873 depicting the Jews. This is the time of the Russian pogroms, where the Russians would go in and sometimes just obliterate entire villages of the Jews, destroy their possessions, clear them out of an area. If you've ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, it depicts that sort of activity now that takes place, if I remember correctly, in the early 1900s, but still the time of the Russian Tsar. And also during this time, you have the trial of French Captain Alfred Dreyfus. He was a Jewish officer in the French army who was accused and convicted wrongly, as it turned out, of selling secrets to the enemy. It quickly turned out that somebody else had framed him, and then the French military very obviously looked in the other direction and cooperated with the frame because it was in their interest to cover up, one of their own soldiers, but also they felt like their honor was at stake, and so they allowed him to be sent to Devil's Island. And he was retried, and again, the military court found him to be guilty, and it was very obvious that there was evidence that was exonerating him, and they didn't want to look at it. And finally, there was a trial that came and did exonerate him, and he was returned a thoroughly broken man for his experiences, and it was a picture of the hostility against the Jews that Europe was extending, which would only increase into the 20th century.